Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome to the HWNT Houston Human Trafficking Awareness event. We are talking today about the impact that human trafficking has on Latinos. And I'm here today. I'm thrilled to welcome Darlene Mercado and Sara Breuer. Sara is the collaboration manager with United Against Human Trafficking, and she's worked at the agency for 3 years, educating professionals and communities and collaborating with partners in the community. In her current role, she trains volunteers to deliver human trafficking education. And as part of the Speakers Bureau, she manages the Houston United Against Human Trafficking Coalition. So she has been doing that she's been involved in anti-trafficking since 2008 and has been working at nonprofits for over 10 years. Thank you, Sara, for joining us today.
Thank you so
And
much
we
for having
have,
me.
yes, thank you. We have Darlene Mercado. And Darlene is one of those volunteers who I'm assuming Sara trained. She's a volunteer speaker for United Against Human Trafficking and delivering the Human Trafficking 101 courses to help others gain awareness of human trafficking practices and potential victims. She also works as an instructional designer for companies in various industries, developing courses and training materials that engage learners while consulting teams on training solutions. So thank you, Darlene. Thank you both for being with us here today.
Thank
Yeah,
you so
thank you
much
so
for
much,
having
Sandra.
me. Mhm.
So I introduced myself, but I'm the chair of the Houston chapter. And so I'm thrilled that we're bringing awareness to this topic. I think it's really important that we, an organization, bring forth programming that is real, that is authentic, genuine change is what we're about. HWNT Houston is really committed to that in not only bringing authentic content, but like letting everyone just be themselves and as they join us in our events and things like that. That's really what we go for. So with that, we are going to get started.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandra, for inviting us here today. We are really excited to present on this topic. So again, my name is Sara. I am the collaboration manager with UAHT, and I put this presentation together in response to a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric that I was hearing from the community, as we go out into Houston and the surrounding areas and talk about human trafficking. I was hearing a lot of preconceived notions that, the open border causes more human trafficking. People are coming here from Central and South American countries, and it's causing a rise in human trafficking. But I think there's a misperception, because in reality, folks who are coming from those countries are almost always coming here to work, to take care of their families, and often, if they have an undocumented status, that greatly increases their risk, their vulnerability for being trafficked. And so that's what we're going to dive into today. I also want to say that I'm a white person. I'm not Hispanic or Latinx, and I will never understand what it is like to really be impacted by the things that we're going to talk about. But it was important to me when putting this together to ensure that the voices of people from this community were represented. And I also spoke with staff members from that community to help me put this together. Darlene, did you want to say anything before we get started?
I just want to add that I'm really excited to be here as well. And so being somebody from Mexican American descent, it's something that I definitely see prominent as an issue and being more vulnerable as a victim. So I'm really excited to kind of speak on that as well. And yes, there's a lot of great things in the presentation. So we're both excited to kind of dive into that piece and some of those cultural norms that might be playing a role. But yeah, excited to be here. And I guess we can get started if you're ready, Sara.
I am. Actually, I did have one more extra thing I wanted to mention. So I know that these terms like Hispanic and Latinx to describe communities, there are so many different kinds of communities within Central and South America that don't identify with this label of Hispanic or Latinx. So I just want to acknowledge that it's not even the best kind of term to use to represent, but when we use those terms, these are the communities that we are referring to. Also, this presentation isn't going to be too heavy. We're really not going into graphic details about how people are exploited, but we will still be talking about exploitation, trafficking, abuse, and these can be really heavy topics. So if at any point during the presentation, as a viewer, you're kind of like, that's a lot, that's totally valid. Feel free to mute for a few minutes, take some deep grounding breaths, and join us whenever you are ready. Okay, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and share this presentation. Okay, wonderful. Thank you for your patience. Okay. Don't worry about signing in. So here's kind of an overview of the training for today. We're going to give you some background on how these communities are affected by trafficking, what industries are folks most likely to be exploited through, what are the vulnerabilities that can put people at a higher risk for being trafficked. And then we'll also talk about some of these systemic inequalities. So the systems within the US that are supposed to be supportive of people in this country can actually be harmful in some ways. And then we'll also talk about cultural norms that we see within these communities that might facilitate trafficking. And then we'll talk about what are the barriers to people disclosing their exploitation and then what comes next. I'll also mention we don't have an overview of human trafficking within this presentation. So if you're not familiar with what human trafficking is, it is defined as an action by means of control for the purpose of exploiting someone for sex or labor. So essentially, anytime that someone is forced, manipulated, lied to, coerced into being exploited for sex acts or for labor exploitation, that is a case of human trafficking. And even though this word trafficking makes us think of movement, movement is not necessary. People can be trafficked by their family members out of their home. I want to tell you a little bit about my organization. I'm with United Against Human Trafficking. We are based in Houston, although we have representation in Louisiana and in Florida. And our goal is to end human trafficking through education, prevention, and empowerment. So in my role, I educate the community, everybody from people who work in social service, healthcare, law enforcement, folks in the community, just like y'all. And I also help manage the United Against Human Trafficking Coalition in Houston. We have another location in Calcasieu Parish, Louisiana. We also try to prevent exploitation before it happens in the first place. So we talk to groups that we know can be at a higher risk for being exploited. That includes youth, especially youth in systems like the foster care system, juvenile justice system, people who might experience housing or job instability, substance use disorder, and refugees, immigrants, and asylum seekers, which is the population that we'll really be speaking to today. So we talked to all of these groups about how to recognize when someone might be grooming or recruiting them. And sometimes in these activities, we identify people who are being trafficked. And when that happens, we connect them to services right away. So we have support groups, we have case management, and we have a referral network. Darlene?
Yeah, so thank you, Sarah, for all that overview. So I just want to get us started on an engagement question. So I want to know your thoughts on what Latin American and Caribbean country do you think is likely to be a victim of labor trafficking? And so I want you to go ahead and type in the chat box or in the comment section. So go ahead and type your answer in there, what you think it is. I'm tempted to say, oh, there's no wrong answer, but technically there is a wrong answer in this situation. So just try your best to type whatever country you think that is. So give you a few seconds. Okay, I see one answer. Mexico. Just going to wait a few more seconds for a few more to come in. Haiti, that's a good one. Any other countries that y'all think would be more likely to be a victim of labor trafficking? All of the above, all of them. Okay, these are really great answers. So let's kind of dive into the next section, examining the countries of origin of victims that are more likely to be victimized for labor trafficking from Latin America and the Caribbean countries. And so it is going to be Mexico. So good guess. Sandra definitely got that right. But some other countries that are also targeted are Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Jamaica, Colombia, Brazil, Dominican Republic, and Cuba. And so right here is a chart of all the other countries that we see. But I do want to note that this chart only includes countries with more than 10 potential victims reported. And so this was gathered by the Polaris Project, analyzing data from about 48,000 potential victims of sex and labor trafficking. And so I want to know why y'all think Mexico is one of the main countries. So just type in the chat box of why you think that is. So while I'm waiting for responses in the comment box, these statistics can also be found on the executive summary on the Latina Face of Human Trafficking and Exploitation document, found right on the Polaris website, which we can provide after the training if y'all are interested in seeing that. There's a lot of great resources on the website, and they're also available in Spanish, which is nice. So I don't see many responses about why you think Mexico is one of the main countries, but it does. Oh, I do see one. Yes, great. Border access. Yes. So it does have to do with location, right? The Mexican border is right there. But other countries are subject to being labor trafficked or sex trafficked as well. So let's go on to the next slide and kind of see the scope of the problem. So individuals from Latin America account for a large percentage of identified victims in 18 of the 25 types of trafficking, sadly. And so out of that, 76% of likely victims in the agriculture sector were immigrants, and nearly half were from Mexico. And this has to deal with a lot of the times when you're a migrant farm worker, they'll actually have Mexicans recruit from their country of origin and kind of get them to come over and start working for them. And so a lot of the time there's glorifying that there's more opportunities in the US. And so it's kind of motivating to come over here. They're also fleeing violence and economic desperation situations. But a lot of the time they're more vulnerable because there's this threat of deportation. And so, like Sara said, there's other forms of coercion, but that is a huge one when it comes to this community. And refugee and immigration policies also kind of contribute in making them more vulnerable to trafficking, which we'll discuss later. But about 60% of victims in the construction sector were from Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And about half of those 17,000 likely victims from 2015 to 2018 in that Polaris study were recorded with recorded immigration status were not U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents. But I do want to note that even if they have a work visa, they're still subjected to being labor trafficked as well, just due to being able to kind of use that threat of not employing them any longer. And if they're not employed by the employer, then they have to leave the country. And so for the next slide, I want y'all to kind of type in the comment box, what industry do do you think that workers come from or are more vulnerable to human trafficking? So do you think it's agriculture, escort services, hotels, and hospitality? So just type in there whether you think it's A, B, or C. Just give y'all a few seconds to answer this question. I see A, agriculture, A, C, hotels and hospitality. Okay, these are all great answers. So let's see what this the answer is. So we're gonna first explore some other relevant industries, but for sure it is agriculture. That is the primary industry that we see labor trafficking in. But some other ones that we see quite often is domestic labor, and this is kind of referring to somebody who's employed in a residential home, more likely, and so they're usually somebody that is living in the home. They're looking after children, or they're doing the cooking and cleaning. So they're more prone to this because a lot of the time they've immigrated here, but also there's this language barrier. They're not able to kind of communicate to others. They're more isolated. But some other industries that we see this in is in construction, restaurants, landscaping, escort services, bars, strip clubs, and cantinas. And so this chart right here is from Polaris as well, and it shows the types of sex and labor trafficking from Latin America and the Caribbean victims from 2015 to 2018. And so for the next slide, I'm going to pass it on to Sara, and she's going to kind of go into some of those vulnerabilities that we see in this community.
Thank you so much, Darlene. And if y'all are curious about where these numbers came from, a lot of the information for this presentation came from a report that Polaris Project put out called the Latino Face of Human Trafficking in the United States. So Polaris Project is the nonprofit that operates the human trafficking hotline. And so whenever it's safe and people make a call, they collect information. So they actually have released a bunch of different reports about how individuals from Central and South America are exploited in this country. So if you're curious about that, you can just Google Polaris Project Latino, and you'll see the reports that they have. And if you have any trouble finding it, I can put some links in the comments once the live is wrapped up. All right, so why are folks from this community more vulnerable to being trafficked? So there are a lot of immigration policies within the US that can increase vulnerability. For example, a lot of times people are coming here because they are fleeing violence. There aren't any opportunities to make money and support their families. And so they are kind of desperate to be in the United States. And because a lot of times the response to undocumented immigration is immediate deportation, and that can be a really scary thing if, sometimes even if someone is being exploited and they're only making $5 an hour or even $5 a day, that might still be more money than they were making in their country of origin. So that threat of immediate deportation is probably the most common form of coercion that we see affecting this population. And there can also be a bias against authorities. If someone comes from a country where you can't trust law enforcement, the law enforcement is inherently corrupt, then they might believe our law enforcement is as well. And I will say, here at United Against Human Trafficking, we work with some amazing law enforcement partners, both local agencies, federal agencies from HPD, HCSO, HSI, and we have some incredible partners that we work with that are really dedicated to identifying people who are being exploited and getting them connected to care. That being said, I have also heard of stories where law enforcement maybe didn't know about the Trafficking Victims Protection Act or didn't know the proper policy or protocol. And even if they encountered someone who was being trafficked, they either couldn't identify it as trafficking, or they just thought that person was a criminal and started deportation proceedings immediately. Smuggling. So smuggling and trafficking are actually two separate crimes, even though we hear them used interchangeably a lot, especially in news stories. So smuggling is when someone pays for a service to be moved over a border. The commodity is transportation. It's always consensual. Whereas trafficking, just like I said in the beginning, movement is not necessary. People can be trafficked by family members and never leave their home. But smuggling creates a vulnerability for trafficking, because if someone is entering the country without documentation, most likely they're coming here to work, right? And it can be really easy for that smuggler to say, hey, if you want a job where people are not going to ask questions about your documents, I can help you work on this farm, this construction site, this cantina. And smugglers might be in league with traffickers and pass them off. Or smugglers might be traffickers and they might say, you still owe us $5,000 for your smuggling debt, and in order to pay it off, you are going to have to work for me. And that is a system known as debt bondage, which is a form of coercion. And just like Darlene mentioned in the beginning, the United States is held in this esteem all over the world as this place where, if you can just make it to the United States, the American dream, you can make money, you can be safe, you can take care of your family. And so that can really influence a lot of migration into the United States. And so in terms of recruitment, when someone is trafficked from another country, that trafficker is usually also from that country of origin. So traffickers know how to use that rhetoric of like, hey, I can get you to the United States. I can help you make all this money. I can help all the arrangements with your visa and getting to the US. And having that method of coming here can be maybe someone's only opportunity to get out of a situation where they're not safe or they can't take care of their family. And then we want to talk about some of the systemic inequalities. And for context, I have put together a presentation on how human trafficking affects multiple marginalized communities. And the more research I found, the more I found inequalities in almost every system. But here I just wanted to focus on these four. So in terms of the legal system, as I said before, anti-immigrant policies can really restrict people's access to justice. So under the TVPA, if someone is in this country because they are being trafficked, they are entitled to protection and services under the TVPA, and there is a path for them to get U.S. citizenship if they meet those requirements. However, because there's a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric and policy, individuals might not be able to access life-saving services like healthcare, legal, or economic services. They might be scared that if somebody finds out that they're undocumented, that they are going to be deported, they're going to be taken away from their family. They might be scared of being incarcerated. And some of the policies I found were increased border security, public charge rules. So public charge rule, because some of the anti-immigrant rhetoric that we hear can be, oh, people are coming here into the US and they can't work, and so they're just taking government money. But what the public charge rule says is that individuals that have a physical disability or an intellectual disability, there is no path to citizenship for those individuals. They're not allowed to immigrate to the United States. And that can be really dangerous because people who have physical or intellectual disabilities can be at a higher risk of violence and danger. H-2A visas are a visa that allows someone to live and work in the United States working in agriculture, usually as a migrant farm worker. And as Darlene showed us earlier, agriculture was overwhelmingly the most common industry that we saw people being trafficked. So this is interesting because employers will bring people usually from Mexico, but it can be other countries, to the United States to work in agriculture under an H-2A visa. However, because their status in the US is tied to their visa, employers often use that to exploit workers because they essentially have control over them. And if somebody wants to speak out against this employer or, speak out against the exploitation they're experiencing, they're at risk of their visa being taken away and then being deported. Detention camps, these are really scary places. I did some research and found a documentary on YouTube, and I'll also try to link it in the comments, where people were talking about their experience in detention camps. And there were situations where people were put into deportation proceedings because they did not have documentation to be here, even if they had lived here for like 5, 10, 15 years. And then in those detention camps, they were often exploited for their labor and told that if they don't, perform this labor, then they would lose privileges like seeing their family, talking to a lawyer, or they would be thrown into solitary confinement, which is, clear labor trafficking. And then separation policies. I'll be honest, I haven't done the research to see how immigration policies have changed under Biden versus how they were in Trump. If someone wants to put in the comments, I would be happy for that clarification. So I'm not sure if we still have separation policies, but I can speak to this. If children are separated from their parents, their caretakers, they are at an exponentially higher risk of being trafficked. And I can speak to this because there are a lot of Central American minors coming into the United States unaccompanied, because it's easier to get them through as youth and for people to come over as families with parents. And those minors are being trafficked at really scary rates and numbers. I believe there was a New York Times article that came out recently claiming that there were like somewhere around 100,000 Central American minors that were unaccounted for and likely being trafficked. So within the healthcare systems, and I mean, healthcare is critical for us to be safe and healthy and to thrive, right? But if those services don't have the language and the cultural background to be able to serve people, then those individuals can't access those systems and those resources. There are limited providers that speak Spanish, and there can be really restrictive healthcare policies. For example, if you are undocumented, you can't exactly sign up for health insurance or get a job that can offer you all of these benefits. And so that really restricts people's access to healthcare. And if you are not healthy, it's a lot harder to advocate for yourself and your rights. In social systems. So within the context of representation, there can really be a lack of meaningful, consistent media. If people from this community are represented as villains or drug dealers or what have you in media and even in news stories, that can sometimes misrepresent people that are in cases, then it's kind of twofold, because if people aren't from those communities and they see that representation, they might develop an idea in their mind of, oh, people coming from these countries are this kind of person. And if people who are from these countries see that representation, they might think, oh, this is what people in the United States think of people like me. That makes me really scared to ask for help or trust people. And just to kind of push this a little bit further, that stereotyping can be used to justify violence, persecution, and discrimination. I think a really potent example of this was when there was a shooter in South Texas, and I don't remember the city exactly. Feel free to put in the comments. And this person was emboldened by anti-immigrant rhetoric to commit a really horrific act of violence against people from this community. And also there are so many nuances within this community. For example, people who might be indigenous, Afro, Latinx, there are just so many different representations that, people who are not in these communities may not understand a lot about, people who identify. All right, Darlene, I'm passing it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So let's dive into some of those cultural norms and barriers that are playing a role into contributing to human trafficking. For sure, one of them that we see quite a bit is this idea of working very hard, right? And so this can kind of promote labor trafficking. I know growing up, you didn't really judge what type of job it was. Like you're taught to work very hard, accepting any job opportunity that comes your way, and kind of just being able to support your family. And so this kind of feeds into machismo, which is this idea in the Latinx community where it's usually this strong masculinity or idea or patriarchy that the male or the men of the household need to be, the breadwinners. They have the control of the household. They come first in situations, and then women are kind of sexualized, or they're like second-class citizens, and they come after. And I know an example, especially coming from my parents that are Mexican, they immigrated here, that a lot of the time women eat last. So like if you're serving dinner, the men of the household are served first because of out of respect. And there's this idea that you're supposed to respect them no matter what, even if, like, let's say they're abusing other family members, no matter what, you have to respect them. And so this can kind of feed into and kind of promote sex trafficking as well, but also these methods of recruitment where it kind of normalizes abusing women as well, especially younger women who kind of grow up already being exposed to some type of abuse. And so we already know that already makes somebody more vulnerable to being sex trafficked. And it's a way to have this control over other individuals as well. And then there's also this lack of knowledge of labor laws. And not being fully aware of the labor laws can kind of put them in situations where maybe they don't really realize their full rights. But there's this lack of recognition to trafficking. And this kind of ties into where we kind of looked at domestic labor. That is a huge industry where we see labor trafficking. And if someone is working in a household and they're employed by somebody and they're taking care of children, however, they're working very long hours, they're isolated, we don't see that maybe they're being abused. And so not being able to recognize that or just not having this full understanding of what their labor rights are can feed into and kind of promote labor and sex trafficking. And so let's kind of go on to the next slide and kind of look at some of these barriers for those victims to disclose or receive services. And so some of these are cultural incompetence. And so a lot of times service providers, they don't have this a full understanding or of the cultural differences that exist in this community and customs. And then another huge one is the language barrier. A lot of services and resources are not always offered or provided in Spanish. And of course, if there's a language barrier, sometimes they're not able to come forward and, ask for help as well.
And so, I just wanted to tell a quick story about this aspect of cultural incompetence. So there was a training that I attended where these service providers were talking about an incident where they were working with an indigenous woman from Guatemala. And they were seeing a lot of red flags for trafficking. And they did have a case manager who spoke Spanish, but this case manager did not understand the cultural background of, indigenous from Guatemala. So even though she could speak the language, especially when we're talking about these really intense topics like domestic violence, intimate partner violence, human trafficking, exploitation, these are themes that might not be present in a lot of cultures, or, understanding that cultural context can help you to explain these things to somebody. And if somebody doesn't understand the cultural context, then they might have trouble telling somebody, you are a victim of trafficking. These are your rights. This is the definition of human trafficking. So having that cultural understanding is really important. And then let's say that people do recognize that they are being exploited or trafficked and they do want to do something about it. There are already a lot of barriers set up, again, and I know I've said this quite a few times, but if people are coming here without documentation, it's most likely to work and take care of their family, right? And let's say, because people can still be paid, and that doesn't mean they're not being trafficked. So people might be getting paid, a minuscule amount of money, but it's still some amount of money that is keeping their family alive and providing them for their basic needs. So if they were to take time off of work to see a service provider, see a lawyer, any of that, then they're losing wages. And that, not getting paid for that day might mean that their family doesn't have dinner or doesn't eat for a day. And there are agencies here in Houston and nationally that will help people figure out their rights and apply for visas and immigration status for free. But if people don't know about those services and they just go to a regular immigration lawyer, those fees might be really expensive to help them fill out a trafficking visa application, to help them apply for citizenship, to sue their employer for exploitation. Those can all be really expensive things. And if they can't afford to go through that, then they lose access to those rights. And there might also be cultural norms about family privacy, right? It can be a really intimate thing to say, like, hey, yeah, my wife, my children are exchanging sex for money out of this cantina. Or, I have been exploited. And building on what Darlene was talking about machismo, because of this, how important masculinity can be to a lot of these cultures, people may not want to, or men specifically may not want to appear as a victim or ask for help or appear weak. And so we wanted to talk about some case studies, and these are not true case studies, but they are based on true stories that we have heard of people who've been trafficked from Central and South America. So let's say we have Sophia. She met this super handsome, really charming guy in Mexico. He got to know her family. He convinced her, hey, let's move to Houston and start a new life together. But once he brought her to the United States, she was shoved in a house where there were 10 other teenage girls. They were closely monitored. There was a guard watching them at all times. And then she was forced into prostitution at a cantina. The trafficker said that if she refused to be commercially sexually exploited or tried to leave, then her family back in Mexico would be hurt. And so she wasn't allowed to leave the cantina. And the trafficker also told her that because he brought her to the United States and smuggled her here, she had to pay him $5,000 to pay off a smuggling debt. She's really scared to work with law enforcement because she doesn't want anything to happen to her family. And so this case study is actually based on a case study of a trafficker named Gerardo Salazar. He had the nickname El Gallo, and he used that technique. He would get to know women and their families, bring them to the U.S., and traffic them in cantinas by threatening their families back home in Mexico. And then I wanted to talk about labor trafficking as well. So let's say we have Marcos. He comes to the U.S. with an H-2A visa to work as an agricultural worker. So while he's working here, he lives in these really rough conditions. He is sharing a trailer with 5 other men. There isn't even a lot of room for all of them. He doesn't really have access to a phone. There are a lot of rules about where he can go, who he can contact, things that he can and can't do. He works really long hours and only earns like $5 an hour. And he and the other workers are only allowed to leave their work site to buy groceries. So let's say he is getting groceries and the cashier notices hey, something is really weird here. These folks look malnourished. They look, really tired. They're kind of not talking. And so the cashier speaks Spanish, and he's able to talk to this individual and eventually get him help. So that's an example of how H-2A visas can be used to traffic people, even though they are a legal system. All right. So I wanted to round this out on a more positive note and talk about how we can create equity for people in this community. So how can we fight human trafficking in general? Vetting labor contractors, especially construction, landscaping, contracting services, day laborers that are hanging out at Home Depot hoping to get work. All these people have rights. And so if you're working with a labor contractor, ask them, do their employees have benefits? Are they licensed? Can you see any documentation to make sure that these folks are getting paid? And, we're living in a society where we want things quick, we want things cheap. And so if there's somebody who's doing renovations and they're working with labor contractors, they want the cheapest one. But the reality is that a lot of times that lower cost or that immediacy results in people being exploited in the process. Support local organizations. So we are really lucky here in Houston in that we have a lot of organizations that are supporting Hispanic and Latinx communities, immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. And so this is a great example, the Hispanic Women's Network of Texas, just supporting. This is already a great organization, but if you have other organizations in your community that are working with labor rights, workers' rights, supporting immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, that can be really effective. Because if there are organizations that don't, again, understand the language and the cultural context, they're not going to be as effective as the people who are working in those communities that are from those communities. And addressing anti-immigrant rhetoric. Unfortunately, we hear this a lot, even from people that we care about, like our friends, our family members, our neighbors. So, and this can be a really scary thing. As someone who is personally really sensitive, sometimes I hear these things and I freeze up and I get really anxious. And I know that if I say something, I'm going to get really upset. But if you're in a position, especially if this is a person that you care about, that you might ask hey, what did you mean by that? And a lot of times people spread this kind of rhetoric because they think it's okay. And if you don't say something, then you think it's okay. But holding people accountable for their words, because those words have real world implications on people's safety. Continuing to learn. Like I said, Polaris Project has a ton of reports specifically on this community, specifically on, H-2A and H-2B visas, how people can be trafficked through cantinas. So they have a ton of resources to learn more about this issue. Talk to your elected officials. We are their constituents, and they are held responsible to the issues that we bring up as their constituents. So if you're hearing about people who are victims of trafficking or labor exploitation being deported, or mistreatment of immigrants and refugees, maybe they put asylum seekers onto a bus and put them on, sent that bus to another state. Talk to your elected officials and say, hey, as your constituent, this is something that's really concerning for me. And share information. We have a ton of resources that are also in Spanish. And so if you're interested in those, I have a little bit of follow-up to do. There are self-identification questions and cards that you can post in areas where you might see folks that are looking for work, and they can help people identify if they are being trafficked. And they're questions like, do you owe your employer money? Were you told that you had a debt to pay off? Are you able to keep the money that you earn? Was your family threatened? And so we have those awareness cards and posters in Spanish. So if any of y'all are interested in having those materials and posting them somewhere, I'll put those resources in the comments after we wrap up. Some more things that we can do. Voting. Voting is super important, whether it's local elections, national elections. Do your research on candidates and ballot measures, because everything does have an impact. And change starts with us. So it's, I really encourage everybody, especially myself, to examine, what are the norms and biases that I have that may have contributed to these things? How can I, address those biases or create more equitable spaces for people? I also wanted to give y'all some resources. So like I said, under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, if individuals are in this country because they are being trafficked, they are eligible for legal rights and remedies. So if they're in the country because they're being trafficked, in order to access those remedies, there are some prerequisites. They have to be willing to comply with reasonable requests from law enforcement, and they also have to be willing to disclose their undocumented status. But if they meet those requirements, they can automatically get continued presence. And that's great because people can get that automatically, and they can also get a work permit. The best legal remedy that we have is the T visa. So the T visa is only for victims of trafficking, and there are 5,000 of these allocated every year, and that quota is never met. So these are always available. Additionally, if someone has family members in the country of origin that are at risk because of the trafficking situation, they can get derivative T visas and also be brought to the United States. So it's really important to spread the word about this T visa. Additionally, if someone has their T visa for 3 years, then they can apply for their green card. So Catholic Charities, Tahari Justice Center, and Baker Ripley are all agencies here in Houston, and I believe they have other locations that can help individuals. They can help answer questions about immigration. They can help fill out the application for a T and U visa, and their services are free. So Catholic Charities, Tahari Justice Center, and Baker Ripley are amazing resources. Also, if someone just thinks that their rights are being violated, we actually just recently at the coalition had a presentation by Lucy Garcia of the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division. And she told us all about our labor rights, which I'll be honest, I didn't really know a lot beforehand. And that department is really passionate about uncovering labor exploitation, but they need tips. They need to know when people are being labor exploited. So when people file a complaint, they can do so anonymously. It is illegal for the employer to retaliate against them, but they really do want those tips, even and especially from people who are undocumented. And they assured us that if people are undocumented, they would still be kept safe and be connected to resources. So I have the number there if you want to report labor violations. Also, there is the Workers Defense Project here. They work specifically with workers in the construction industry, and they have a ton of resources. They're essentially a union and labor organizing organization. And then case management. So here at United Against Human Trafficking, we offer case management for people who have been trafficked for labor or for sex, any nationality. And so I have the email for our case manager there. And then YMCA International is the main victim service provider here in the greater Houston area. They have the Trafficked Persons Assistance Program, and they can help with all ages, all nationalities, all kinds of trafficking. And I have their number there. So if you just think that there might be human trafficking, you spoke to that labor contractor and they said, oh, this is the lowest price that you're going to get because, I'm only paying these workers $10 a day. Or you are passing a cantina and maybe you go into this cantina and you realize that there are young girls there that are being commercially sexually exploited. If you suspect human trafficking, please call the human trafficking hotline at 888-373-7888. This is a national number, so wherever you are in the United States, you can call this number and be connected to local hotline operators. The operators are bilingual in English and Spanish and can also provide translation to up to 200 languages. So we can use this number in a bunch of different ways. If you just suspect human trafficking and you're not sure what to do, you can call this number. If you want to file a tip with trained law enforcement, you can call that number. Someone who thinks that they might be a victim of human trafficking can call this number and be connected to services. There's a lot of great ways to utilize this. And if you're just looking for information, resources, data, you can either go to polarisproject.org or humantrafficking.org. Okay, that completes the presentation. If you want to give us some feedback, feel free to scan this QR code and let us know what you think. And since this is Facebook Live, you can pause it to get the QR code. And I'll go ahead. Here's our contact information. If you have any additional questions, feel free to email me. Okay.
Okay, thank you guys. We're so happy to be here. And I guess if you have any questions, you can drop them in the comment box, or you can email us or contact us and for more information.
Wow. Thank you, ladies. Thank you so much for such an insightful and just resourceful presentation. The approach, it's just spot on. It really is. So thank you very much. We've got feedback in the comments of just what a wonderful, just bringing awareness, how wonderful it is, the work that you're doing. We will continue our work as an organization in bringing valuable content to our community and bringing awareness to topics that are important, not only to Hispanic women, Latina women, but just in general, people, for everyone. And so we're doing our part, and want to thank you very much for speaking with us today, for taking time out of your day to inform us, to inform our community. We'll continue doing our part. So thank you very much for everything that you do. We really, really appreciate you. Let me see. So yes, comments are coming through. Thank you just for the presentation and all of the ways that we can be helpful and the ways that we can be aware. I've got tons of notes on different things. And so it really, really was great information. So if anyone has any questions, you can go ahead, and we are monitoring the comments for just a minute. If you have a question for Sara or for Darlene, feel free to put it in the chat, and they can address it.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited. Thank you again so much for inviting us to speak on this topic, especially because, labor exploitation is actually a lot more prevalent than sex trafficking. And that makes sense when we think about, who is harvesting our food, who is putting our clothes together, who's putting our technology together. Labor exploitation is the norm in a lot of global supply chains. And since there can be a lot of people from Central and South America that are in a vulnerable position, it's often folks from these communities that can be more vulnerable to exploitation. But because we see so much attention on sex trafficking, and I think there should be, that's absolutely valid. We need to pay attention to sex trafficking. I feel like a lot of times people don't understand labor trafficking, or it's hard to identify. If you see someone on the street exchanging a sex act for money, or it looks like they're going to do that, that's pretty obvious. But when we see someone at a construction site, someone waiting in the parking lot at Home Depot, we pass a farm and there are farm workers there, it's so hard to know because it just looks like a labor situation. So I'm really glad that this is live and that we had so many viewers. We're going to give y'all some resources to be able to identify these kinds of situations and take action. So yeah, thank you again for inviting us.
Definitely, yes. The distinction that and how you spoke about the sex trafficking and then the labor trafficking and just all of the resources and sort of things that you provided. This is definitely a live to share. It will be saved on our pages, both on Facebook and on LinkedIn. So this is definitely something to share with your network. Lots of great information and things to rewatch. If you didn't catch us for the whole thing, definitely watch all the way through. Thank you again, Sara. Thank you, Darlene, for being with us today. We appreciate you. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.